Lesley Jones, and I am the co-host today. Your teacher, Molly, is going to take over in just a minute. But before we start, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. We do recognize that the Alaska Native Nations, upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside, in Fairbanks, our Troth-Yetta campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Dene Athabascan people of the lower Tanana River. And that's where I am today, up here in Fairbanks. And I work for UAF's Cooperative Extension Service, and we teach all sorts of topics to the public. And today we are partnering with Rural CAP as part of the Tribes Extension Program to reach people all over the state of Alaska who are interested in traditional foods and food security. So our instructor today, Molly, is going to teach us a bit about the traditional healing that is in moose bone. So we're really excited for that. We do have a recipe that we will share with you guys after class, so don't worry, everything she teaches you will be in that recipe. And Molly, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Lesley. It is an honor to be here today with each and every one of you. Welcome to my kitchen. My kitchen is on the unceded lands of the Kanik tribe, and I am very grateful to be here with you all today. I am very excited about sharing this bone broth recipe. I use it all the time. It is a way to honor and respect the animals that we harvest by utilizing every part of the animal. So by using the meat, that's wonderful. By saving the bones and cutting them to size for the cook pot that you'll be using is another great way to add essential nutrients into our diet while also respecting the animal that we've harvested. And you can make bone broth out of any bone. You can make fish bone broth, chicken bone broth, beef bone broth, any animals with bones. You can make a broth out of the bones. And that being said, today we're going to do moose bone broth because it's something I still have in my freezer. And I hauled out all the long bones for my friend's last moose kill last fall. So my job was carrying the bones, carried them out, got them cut up to size, and shrink wrapped them, kept them in my freezer. And now I have a small one here that I will show you in the process of making. And then I have got some prepared already to show you the second stage. So before we begin, I just want to invite all of us to just take a moment, take a deep breath in, maybe sigh it out, shake it out, release any tension you might be feeling in your body, release any worries that might come to you today, and just allow yourself to be here now. And then I invite you to place a hand, maybe both hands on your heart, close your eyes, breathe 5 deep breaths into your heart. And during this breath work, I would like to honor and appreciate the ancestors that came before me. The matriarchal line of my family from Tununic, Alaska, and Finland, and my patriarchal line from County Kerry, Ireland. I just want to acknowledge all the ancestors that came before, filtering down their wisdom into me and you, into each and every one of you. And then honoring the ancestors, we also honor those who are yet to come, the next generation and the generations to follow. So I breathe in gratitude for all those people. Kayana, thank you. So now that we've had a little moment of mindfulness, this is the best state of mind to begin our bone broth making. So bone broth's very, very simple. Essentially, you only really need 3 ingredients: water, a bone, and some vinegar. So a lot of people have vinegars of choice. They like apple cider vinegar, maybe white vinegar is the only vinegar they have. Maybe they make their own vinegar. Today, I'm going to be using a vinegar I made. This is a ferment, the brine. I fermented some kimchi in, and then I actually squeezed out the brine and let the brine continue to ferment until it vinegared. So that will allow, the vinegar actually helps in the process by combining the acid from the vinegar, the acetic acid from the vinegar with the heat and the water. We're actually we're leaching the nutrients, these really sturdy nutrients that are intrinsic within the bone matrix. We're leaching it out and bringing it into the broth. So we're actually pulling medicine from the bone and bringing it into the broth itself. So that's why we end up with this lovely, thick, usually slightly darker broth that has a sheen of collagen and fat on top. Like I said, any bone will do, but the long bones of the animal are great because they cut really well and they have a great marrow source. So this one, it's the end of a long bone, and as you can see, it's full of marrow. So when this cooks, I'll actually be able to just push the marrow straight out. And this is my way of making bone broth. So my way of making bone broth is, as I'm cooking throughout the year, vegetables cross my path. You know, sometimes vegetables aren't in the best shape. So I have a bag in my freezer and I keep like the ends of cabbage. You know, I might not cut that up because it's really hard and fibrous. You know, maybe the bits of the cabbage that don't look perfect. Or, you know, maybe this is, you know, it's nearing the end of its life, its shelf life. So I'm going to add, I actually have a lot of cabbage to add into that. Also onions, you know, like if you ever find that cutting onions is a chore, because you have to, you know, like be so specific, cutting off the ends and then peeling the onion. I just take big cuts off the end, the top and the bottom, makes it really easy to peel. And then I actually, I save these, and that's going to go in the broth. It will add flavor. And actually, if you just use the vegetables themselves, that would be making veggie stock. So we're going to combine the vegetables with the bone to make a really nutrient dense bone broth. So let's begin. You can use just a regular pot, a stock pot, much like this right here. And this works great for making bone broth. You can use a crock pot, that'll speed up the time a little bit, right? My new favorite way is to use an Instapot because it cuts the time down by a quarter. So once we've put all the ingredients in, if I were to add all the ingredients into my stock pot, I would bring it to a boil and then reduce the boil to a simmer and let it simmer from anywhere from 10 to 24 hours. That's a really long time. It's also a really long time to have something on your stove, even if it's on a low simmer. It creates a lot of humidity in the house. So if you have an outdoor cook stove, it works great. The crock pot will reduce the time by half. So 5 to 12 hours in the crock pot. And then with the Instapot, all the ingredients in there, I put it on my soup setting, high pressure, for 4 hours. And then I will strain out the plant materials. I will strain out the bone and the meat, and I will separate it so that the meat will stay on one plate, and I'll put the bone back in the broth to just make sure that everything is, all the nutrients are leached out of the bone. And actually what I tend to do with that bone, because once the calcium and those building blocks like collagen, protein, amino acids that make up the bone, once they are leached out, the bone becomes very brittle and you can actually crush it with your hand. So I crumble it up and add it to my dog's food. So it's another way to keep recycling, right? So I'm making a healing bone broth for myself. The bone that I'm using to make that is eventually going to provide nutrients and some roughage to my dogs as bone meal. So I've got a little under a gallon here because my crock pot is kind of small. I like to put all my vegetables on the bottom, and I had a random extra potato from last winter. So, a part of making bone broth is using the things you might not cook with and eat fresh, but you can add it to your bone broth. It's just going to cook for a really long time and add more nutrients. So I'm going to put a whole potato in there. I'm going to put some of this cabbage. I've got some ginger root because I like the taste. You can put any spices you like. I've got 2 ends of my onion and some onion skin. So you can eat onion skin broth. It is fine. And more cabbage. There you go. So got that in the bottom. Now I'm going to top it with my cold fresh water. It's always best to start anything you're cooking with cold fresh water. Now I don't want to fill it all the way up to the top where the lid's going to sit. I want at least, half a finger, 2 inches, 3 inches of space, because then I'm going to take the bone and I'm going to put it on top, but then kind of push it down to make sure it's submerged.
Hey, Molly, we have our first question.
Yes.
Do you ever put the crumbled bones into compost?
I don't, because I have 2 dogs and they love them so much, but yes, you can put the crumbled bones. What I would recommend is leaving them outside, let them get sun bleached, or you can bake them in your oven to dry them out like really, really well. Make sure there's no moisture hiding in the little pockets of the bone matrix. And then when you crumble it, it'll ensure that you're not introducing any bacteria or fungus or anything that might throw the balance of your garden off. And then I would actually incorporate that bone meal into soil first before topping my plants with that fortified soil. So I hope that answers your question. Now, and of course, follow-up questions to that, please feel free to ask. I'm just going to set this on the counter, plug it in, and then make sure you always have the lid on, because the lid traps the steam, traps the volatile oil compounds, the VOCs, which give it flavor, and it will rain down back into the pot. So last night I started my Instapot and I made this bone broth that I'm going to show you now. So imagine the bone broth we just started. It's been 24 hours. I'm ready to strain it. So I'm going to take a stock pot and, one moment, I forgot a very important ingredient. If you didn't notice yet, I forgot to add my vinegar. So most bone broth recipes, they call for about 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. You can, of course, use vinegar, any kind of vinegar you like. Because I made this vinegar, I use just a little bit more. I use, about a half a cup, and I don't measure it because I'm a home cook and, it's just one more thing to wash. So I eyeball it, a little bit more isn't going to hurt me. and it's not, you know, a little bit more vinegar isn't going to hurt you. It's just going to help the process continue. So yes, we've got that third very important ingredient, the vinegar, to leach the nutrients out of the bone. And that is why I was reminded of it, because I definitely added vinegar to this pot. So I removed it from the Instant Pot. The liquid is still very, very hot, so I'm going to be careful, but the sides are not. So I'm not wearing gloves because it's not hot to the touch up here. But if you were to just pull this out, then please wear gloves. I would hate to see anyone get burned. So if you can see the color of this liquid, it's a bit golden. It's like a golden brown. And that's a pretty standard color for most bone broths. I really like to add chaga, you know, just a tiny little bit of chaga to my bone broth. And then it makes it turn black, like really, really dark. But it's just another way of adding different nutrients. If you like turmeric, you can add turmeric and pepper, and the pepper activates the anti-inflammatory properties of the turmeric. So we're at the very end. We've got the bone floating in there, and we've got a couple of pieces of meat, because this bone I picked has had a lot of meat on it, and now the flesh is literally falling off the bone. So I'm just going to sanitize my hands real quick. And I've got a plate here. So I'm just going to take my tongs and I put a piece of ginger in this batch. Place that off to the side. I've got my bone here. And as you can see, there's still tendon, ligaments hanging off of it. The easiest way for me to do, and actually I'm starting to separate the bone by hand, so it's already very soft. And I'm going to use this little kitchen knife. You can also use your hands to just scrape off any tendinous material to make sure that the only thing left is bone. And if I were to look down the tube of my long bone, and if I were to see anything in there, I would clean it out. But the marrow actually was the first thing to fall out. And I will just show you what that looks like. So we've got that as the marrow. To me, it's beautiful. To others, they might not find it as beautiful. So that's why I do this two-step process. It's another way to get the vegetables out, but it's also a way to separate the bone from the meat, right? And then I have all this meat here. I'm going to set that in a different bowl. Set it off to the side because the moose is cooked plenty. The moose is very tender. And you might worry like, oh, you know, will this overcook the moose? No, it's really hard to overcook moose because the biggest thing that I hear is people think it tastes gamey, even people who are raised on it. If you just throw a moose steak on the grill and cook it for a very short period of time, you might notice it's a bit tough, fibrous. It might not taste gamey, but the characteristics of that tough, sinewy mouthfeel, that's actually that gamey sensation. So to avoid that, I'm actually gonna break up the moose meat when I reincorporate it into the broth. So I have this strained broth, it's beautiful, but my bones, I'm gonna try to break it. I can't break it with my hands. So I'm actually gonna put the bone back in the Instapot, and then the little piece of the bone that fell off, and I'm gonna cover it again with the bone broth. Perfect. So I I would bring this back to either a boil if I'm using a stock pot, back to the low boil if I'm using a crock pot, and back to the high pressure if I'm using the Instapot. And I do another round, 10 hours in the slower cooking, or another 3 or 4 hour session in the Instapot. I'm gonna open up the Instapot, pop that in there, and then turn that back on. So, real quickly, while we let that work its magic, and we're gonna imagine that as I describe the nutrient properties of this amazing healing bone broth, we're gonna imagine that 4 hours has passed in this Instapot, just so that I can use some of that broth to show you a delicious meal you can make with it. So bone broth is amazing. And I know that in modern pop culture, you might have heard, celebrities, people on YouTube talking about bone broth and how amazing it is. And there's even companies coming out. I don't know the names of the companies because I make my own, but lots of different companies I see in the grocery store that are selling bone broths. And it's when you price it out per weight, it's quite expensive. Sometimes they're even selling powdered bone broth or just collagen supplements, which also comes from bones. So we can't verify the source of those bones. And we are lucky enough to live in this wonderful, beautiful land of Alaska, and Alaska provides. So we have friends and family, at least someone in that big group of friends and family hunts, and you might be able to go on those hunting trips. A lot of people, when they hunt in the field, choose to leave the bones out there. They choose to leave the hide also. They might carry the head, the antlers, and the meat back, but unless they have someone willing to pack out the bones, they're usually going to leave them unless they themselves have an interest in bone broth. So the building blocks of bone broth, the nutrient profile, it's full of amino acids. Amino acids are proteins, and basically they're called the building blocks of life. It's full of collagen, and that's because it's got connective tissue on it, ligamental attachments, tendon attachments, as well as the marrow inside, plus the protein. So I know I said amino acids are proteins, but there's specific types of amino acids like glycine in bone broth that isn't naturally occurring in a lot of meats. So you could eat a lot of meat and still not necessarily meet your requirement or your bare requirement for the glycine. Glycine is one of my favorite amino acids, and actually it's so popular for helping sleep and helping gut, like regulate gut health, that they sell glycine, like L-glycine, right? So it helps with blood sugar balance, and it also helps with the neurotransmitters in our brain. And so now that we're talking about neurotransmitters, I'll go into my 5 favorite things about bone broth. The first thing is it's great for our gut. The collagen is really supportive and nutritive, right? It's also coats the inside of our GI tract. So it helps heal the lining, the mucosal lining of our intestinal tract. That's the glutamine in it. So glutamine is another amino acid. That's wonderful. And 30% of the glutamine that you get from your bone broth is actually going to go straight to your GI tract and help heal the intestinal lining, the stomach lining, right? The lower GI tract lining. So the second favorite thing is how it supports our brain. It has the glycine, like I mentioned before, and that helps with development. So we can feed our kids this, literally helping build their brain through nutrition, right? Giving them a leg up on their studies by feeding them foods that are shown to increase activity in the neurotransmitters of the brain and increase the developmental factors. So as we measure a child's growth, we measure developmental factors that they meet. Studies have shown that participants, younger participants that were given bone broth, right, high in glycine, actually experience an anti-inflammatory response in the brain and had quicker cognitive function. Now, they did another study that was really fascinating about traumatic brain injuries. And they found that when someone undergoes traumatic brain injury, the glycine that's available inside the brain drops rapidly. So the theory is that if we add glycine to the diet post-traumatic injury, then we can actually bring the glycine levels back up in our brain and support the anti-inflammatory response so that the brain swelling can come down and we can recover faster from that brain injury. The third favorite thing is how it affects our immune system. So our white blood cells, they need certain nutrients to function properly. So our white blood cells, they are independent movers within our red blood cells. They aren't just following the path of our venous traveled, our veins, as they move, veins and arteries moving through our body. Our white blood cells actually are independent. They can travel around our bloodstream in directions that they choose, and they find foreign bodies and they destroy them. Foreign bodies being infections, different types of diseases, viruses, bacteria, anything that foreign to our body that comes in and tries to diminish our health, the white blood cells actually eat and kill those microorganisms. And it's actually, let me just double check. Yes, it's the glutamine specifically. Yes, the glutamine specifically for the white blood cells. Another thing that's really interesting about how the immune system responds to drinking bone broth, that is pre and post-op surgery. In studies that they've done, they've found that by supplementing our diet with bone broth, both before surgery and after surgery, we reduce our chance of infection. And that includes when we have to have longer hospital stays, which can actually cause more advanced ailments such as MRSA, an advanced antibiotic resistant bacteria to infiltrate our body. And so that's why a lot of surgeries are done outpatient, so that the patient doesn't have to stay in the hospital, because the hospital is constantly disinfecting, antibacterial, constantly wiping. And that's how these super strains of bacteria even came into existence, was actually over cleansing, over killing the bacteria. Because just as we have bad bacteria, we have good bacteria. We have good bacteria in the gut. And so by healing the gut lining, we're actually supporting that good bacteria, our microbiome, sometimes known as our enteric nervous system, but it's also known as our second brain. So the fourth reason I love bone broth is for our joint health, right? We are all aging. I don't care how old you are, we're aging, right? It's a continual process. It's a part of being human. And as a part of being human, we can make the choices to live a healthier life. And by supplementing with bone broth, we can support our joint health and support our body as it ages by providing these vital nutrients, right? Collagen, the amino acids, the amino acid profile, varied profile, right? Of the 18 essential amino acids, I believe bone broth has all of them, as well as more. So, my fifth favorite thing is how it affects the skin. Our skin is our largest organ. And often people don't think about that. They think, oh, our liver's really big, or, lungs, they take up so much space. But actually, the entire outside of our body, the skin, is an organ in and of itself. It operates like an organ. It protects our insides from the outside world. And 70% of our skin matrix is made up of collagen. So by incorporating collagen in our diet, we're actually feeding our skin the building blocks that it needs to make more skin, right? And so anytime we have thin skin, it's easier to get cut. As we age, our skin thins, and if we fall, it could tear. Like the skin can get so thin, it can tear. So by supplementing with collagen, we're actually supporting our skin matrix and allowing it to grow stronger, thus protecting us from the outside world, right? The stronger our skin, the more resilient we are, right? The stronger our skin, the less chance we're going to get scraped and cut and have foreign bodies possibly infiltrating past the skin barrier into our body. So those are my 5 favorite things about bone broth. And I'm sure I could list more, but I just wanted to keep it concise for everyone. That I personally started upping my bone broth. And this is my doggie. She smells the mousse and loves it. And I personally started upping my bone broth consumption when I had a snowboarding accident where I tore my hip labrum and started supplementing with physical therapy with bone broth. And I have noticed a change, not only in the texture of my skin, I think that's the first thing I noticed, but also in the movement pattern of my hip and the way the hip felt from the inside out. Are there any questions?
Yes, we do
Perfect.
have questions. I'm going to add myself so we can chat for a minute. So the first question, which is probably super quick and easy, what's in your sanitizer mix that you sprayed on your hands?
I use just 91% isopropyl alcohol. I keep it in a bottle in my kitchen. I pick a bright pink bottle so I can find it because I'm always placing it random places around my kitchen. So yeah, you can use 70%. Anything over 65% is going to kill bacteria. But in the summer, I get fruit flies, and I actually use the isopropyl alcohol. You can spray fruit flies with this, and they will just drop from the air. It's amazing. And so cleaning countertops, making sure that, we've got a sterile start also helps with pest control.
Emily says that's savage. But fruit flies are such an issue, especially if you have like fruit indoors that you bought at the store, or if you have plants, those little fungus gnats. So that's a really good tip. The other thing I wanted to bring up before our last question is I wanted to ask you, did you roast your moose bones before you put them in the broth, or did you put them in without roasting them?
I don't roast them. I have heard of people that do, but to me, it's an unnecessary step, especially since I'm putting the bone back through another boil with just the broth, and I've separated out the meat, so I'm not going to overcook the meat, right? And I think that's, the idea behind the roasting is that you can kind of scrape off some of the meat and then put the bone in the liquid to let it work its magic. So no, I personally do not. But that being said, by roasting the bone, it's going to add a different flavor profile. So if that's something you like, if you you could even like char it on your grill for a second to add that kind of like, that smokehouse type flavor that will transfer into the broth. So for that reason, that might be your flavor preference. And yeah, go ahead, roast bones.
Awesome. Yeah, I know personally, it depends on where my bone's coming from. Is it a fresh one from the freezer? Or sometimes I will cut the bones off of meat that I've cooked, or save the bones from like a whole chicken that has already cooked and then use that. So yeah, that's great to know that we can do it both ways. We have another question about, we would just like you to repeat the timeline for using the Instapot, which, as a reminder, everyone, we will send out a recipe after class so that you can see that. But Molly, if you want to take over and explain your timeline again.
Absolutely. So every Instapot is slightly different. That's what I've noticed. And I've noticed that they're also not only different in how the screen displays its buttons and all the different combinations, but it also is different, different sizes. I don't know if there's different brands, because I was pretty sure that Instapot was a brand in and of itself, but with the differences I've seen amongst my friends who have them, there's a lot of room for interpretation. So I've experimented a lot with this, and what I found is that on my Instapot there's a button called soup, and when I press it, it'll automatically set a timer to 45 minutes. But it's also got the preset of having high pressure. You can also switch it to a manual mode, right? And then if it's on manual, I would go to the pressure level. I would increase it to high pressure, the highest pressure possible, because that'll increase the heat compacted in that space. And then I would turn the time up to 3 hours or 4 hours. When I press my soup button, it's a preset, but I went ahead and I increased the time to 3 hours and 55 minutes because it will reset to 0 when I click to 4 hours. So I just 3 hours, 55 minutes. That's what it's set at. And it actually, I don't know, I didn't do it intentionally. It just remembered. So every time I press my soup broth button, it remembers the time of 3 hours and 55 minutes. And so I don't have to really change anything. It's preset to the high pressure, 3 hours, 55 minutes. Close the lid. Make sure your vent valve is on close, not steam. So sometimes sometimes they call it like the venting setting versus the sealing setting. Yes. So I just call it open or close, but sealing setting means it's going to steam for a little bit as it gets up to pressure. When it gets up to pressure, that internal, just like a pressure cooker, or sorry, like a canner, will pop that seal up. The pressure keeps that seal up until the pressure is released by turning that nozzle to venting. And be very careful. You might want to grab a mitt when you go to switch it to venting, because as soon as you switch that valve from sealed to vent, it's going to start steaming in every direction. There's so much pressure built up, and we don't want you to get burnt in the face, the chest, the arms, or the hands. And that is a risk with any kind of pressure cooker. These Instapots are so much safer than the original pressure cookers. And actually, I first started cooking with like an old school pressure cooker you would use on the stove. And I mean, it would get so pressurized, it would kind of dance around. And it wasn't made out of the best material. I was very young and it was cheap. And sometimes I feared that it would actually explode. And there have been instances of older versions, like the first incarnations of pressure cookers, doing just that, exploding. So Instapot is, like a feat of engineering in the fact that, they're not known for exploding. They're very well made. It contains the pressure very well. And so, yes, that's the cook time for the Instapot. And then for the stock pot, classic on the stove, 10 to 24 hours. And then we cut that in half when we move it to the crock pot. So then that's 5 to 12 hours. And I hope that answered the question. I love questions, so please bring them on. Ask me any question that comes to your mind. There are no bad questions. All questions are great questions. And as we wait for those questions to come in, I'm actually going to show you a really simple ramen recipe. So right here, I have just one single little brick of, this is a brown rice and millet ramen. I got it at Costco. I actually really like this type because it doesn't come with those flavoring packets. I'm not a huge fan. And then we imagine we've, filtered out the bone. The bone is crumbly. And so I'm going to pour a little bit of that bone broth over my ramen and not even covering the noodles all the way, because I like broth and ramen, of course, but I also really, really like noodles. So, having that balance of noodle to broth is really important. So another thing I love about ramen is it's really quick. It takes about a minute to bring it to a boil, and then you reduce it to a simmer, 3 minutes, and it's done. To top my ramen, I have some pickled eggs, and actually I pickled it in the same vinegar, that kimchi vinegar that I had made. So it's got a similar taste profile, and it actually just hissed when I opened it. So that's how you know it's really definitely fermenting. I'm going to reach in, definitely need a spoon for this. Reach in, grab my egg. I like to soft boil my eggs and pickle them so that I always have some protein on hand. And these are from our chicken stock, like they call it chicken stock. It's just in the Matsu Valley, it's an egg exchange. So these are some local eggs. And I'm just going to place that right there on my plate. Cut it in half, long ways. And I am not a fan of hard-boiled eggs. I really like soft-boiled eggs. So I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. This being a jammy, soft-boiled egg. To make this, you just bring your water to boil with a little bit of salt in the pan. And then I have all my raw eggs in a bowl that fits easily inside the pan so that I can bring it and drop them gently without, letting them crack at the bottom. I just slowly release the bowl into the water, bring it back to a boil, which doesn't take long since the water was already boiling. Set a timer for 7 minutes. And then in your sink, you might create an ice bath, or in some kind of bowl container, make an ice bath. As soon as your timer for 7 minutes goes off, strain out the hot water, put the eggs directly in the ice bath. It'll contract the inside of the egg. It'll make it easier to peel the eggs, and it'll also create that nice jammy center. And you've cooked an egg too far when the outside of the yolk is gray. So that's like a very hard boiled egg. And that's in the 8-minute, 9-minute, 10-minute range. And so since this is ramen's classically topped with a soft boiled egg. So that's what we're going to top it with. We've got our broth working its magic. And then please feel free to interrupt with any questions.
Yeah, Molly, I'm gonna ask a question. When you freeze it, like, what size containers do you use to freeze it?
So I bring it completely to room temperature. And then I'll use a ladle. So when you're looking at the bone broth, it's going to striate. If I were to pour it into a glass, which actually is a great idea, and I'm going to do it for you so you can see. So when I pour the bone broth into a glass, it's going to separate. And the top, like the fat, is going to float. And oops, excuse me. So you'll see a sheen on top. And so it's still a little agitated. I'm just going to let that sit so it begins to separate. So you bring your pot of bone broth to completely room temperature. You don't need to put it in the fridge. Just make sure it's not hot at all. Completely room temperature. Then I take out my handy dandy freezer bags. I use either the vacuum seal bags or the Ziploc freezer bags. And I take a ladle and I actually dip it, or a cup or a measuring cup. I dip it in and pull it out instead of pouring, because when you pour, usually the top goes in faster and then you get to the bottom. So it's going to be different quality of broth as you're filling up containers. So I usually take a bowl. I put the freezer bag in the bowl as if I'm lining a little trash can. So I have that stable surface to actually start ladling in my broth. And then I count the cups, right? Because I want to know what is in my freezer, and I want to know how much, so that when I go to make something later, I can either break off a chunk or I can thaw the whole packet and use the whole thing. So by ladling it in, you're going to get all the different layers. You're going to get the layer at the bottom, which is going to be more meaty and have little tiny chunks of meat. You're going to get that little middle layer that's going to be more slightly clearer, and then you're going to get the top layer that's going to be full of the fatty bits and the tendon. And if you were to let that cool overnight or outside, you would actually harden like a disc of fat on top, and that's a good thing. That's actually what you want. So please, if you see that on your bone broth, don't be tempted to take that fat puck off and throw it away or give it away, because that fat puck is actually the thing that has the most nutrients in it. So by reheating the broth, you're going to reheat the fat, reincorporating it into the entire I call it a beverage, but it's stock, it's broth. You can drink it, instead of coffee in the morning. Or you can use it as a base for your soups, and just like I'm doing. And my ramen is done. I'm just gonna pour it in my bowl. And
so Molly, I'd love to share real quick. I sometimes will let that fat cap harden, and then I will pull it off and use it to start a soup. So I will put it into my pan and then toss my onions in and my carrots and celery, and then follow with my bone broth to make a really nice base for a soup, so that it all reincorporates again. But yeah, sometimes I use it as like an actual cooking fat, which is really yummy.
That is a great perspective. I love that. And especially since you're reincorporating the broth back into it, right? So as long as they eventually come back together and we ingest it together, we're getting those nutrients. So yeah, it's almost like tallow. You could scrape off a spoonful, put it in your skillet, caramelize your onions, even like cook whatever other vegetables or meats you're going to use in your soup. And then, like Lesley said, reincorporate the broth on top. So you don't have to add any other fats to make your meal, to make your delicious soup. You won't have to add any other cooking fats. I love that suggestion, Lesley. Love it. Definitely have used it. And actually, I even just scraped a little bit of that fat off and used it independent, and then had a little bit of broth later in the day. In the morning when I drink broth, it fills me up. It feels really nourishing, and like it sits in my stomach really well. It almost feels like soul food, like it's feeding my soul what it needs. And for that reason, I love it. But it's really, I mean, for an 8-ounce cup, they say it's about 50 calories. So it's a very low calorie food. So if you're on a journey where you are trying to incorporate more low calorie foods, this is a great way to do it. But that being said, we can be too low calorie, and you might want to add some more fats and protein. So although I'm making this ramen with some broth, and right now I have just the starts of my chives, and next week we'll be talking all about chives. We're wild about chives, but I've just got a little, and I'm going to top my ramen with that. Just add a little color and add my egg. And then I'm actually going to break up some of this moose meat and add it on top for additional protein. So we've got our finished ramen. And I'll turn it around because the eggs are so pretty floating in there. And this took less than 10 minutes, start to finish, with the broth already made. And so going back to me freezing, right? So if I'm using these bags to freeze, I then take a cookie sheet out. I seal the bags, make sure there's no air in it, or I use the vacuum sealer. And then on my cookie sheet, I lay the bags flat. I label them with the amount of liquid that's in it, what is in it, the type of bone I use to make the broth. Because as my mentor said, you should never let anything leave your kitchen unlabeled. And that includes anything going into the freezer, because you could forget what it is, and that could create food waste in the future. So to avoid that, we label everything. And so by freezing them flat, it makes it so much more manageable to bring out a flat pack of broth. Maybe you just want 1 cup. You can break that flat brick of frozen broth really easily, and then just use a little bit at a time. Keep it in the freezer. Only use what you need. Maybe you have a big family dinner coming up. You take the whole bag out of the freezer, thaw the whole thing, make a big pot of pho or Vietnamese soup or barley and beef, like it's great to have on hand so that we can make these really simple, nutritious, hearty meals that don't cost a lot, because the majority of it is water. And then all the medicine is coming from the nutrients within the bone, the meat, and any random plants that you put inside. And speaking of bones, since we're talking about moose bones, I trust moose bones. Like, I trust our Alaskan moose. And I know that, there have been, there have been declines in certain areas, and with that decline in the moose population, it's even more important that we utilize every single part of the animal. Very, very important. It's a big part of respectful harvesting. So when we talk about respectful harvesting, we could talk about plants, but we definitely need to talk about the respectful harvesting of animals. And mass production of meat usually doesn't follow respectful harvesting trends. So the quality of nutrients within those mass farmed, mass produced meats is going to be different than the quality within a wild game animal. So say, mass farm chickens who aren't able to spread their wings. They're going to have a different nutrient profile in their body than wild chickens that you grow in your backyard. They're going to have more vitamin D when they're grown in your backyard, right? The ones grown indoors aren't going to have that. That's why they have to literally inject them with supplements so that they can meet those nutrient profile needs. So when you're using things that aren't coming from a wild harvest, please choose pasture raised, free range. A lot of these terms, they can be really ambiguous. And sometimes it doesn't even mean that they get to range. It could just mean free range, they get to go outside. But that's still better than being kept in a pen, right? So if you're choosing to eat meat, please choose certain options that might be not only more ethical, but they're going to be more nutritious. So you actually, even though they're more expensive, you can eat less of them and still get as many nutrients. So, or find a local source. Fairbanks, Alaska, everywhere in between, there are farms, there are cooperatives where you can buy a share of an animal, a cow, a goat, a sheep, and then you can actually bring that meat into your home, someone else raising them, and then you can actually reap the benefits of locally grown food. So that to me is a really important part of making bone broth. And so I wanted to leave you with that.